ANDIZI, meaning I will not come down. A stubborn focus on building a great life. Written and read by Beauty Kotela. Chapter 2, Favored to Build. In my young days as a university student, I somehow found myself on the wrong side of someone who was initially my friend. Our friendship started when we were sharing a student flat. We both came from poor families, but she was doing better than I was, and we were both fine with that fact. Now, while I was materially poor, I was socially rich. God blessed me with great friendships, some of which I have kept even till today. This I noticed did not sit very well with my roommate. I guess she subscribed to the notion that she should have been the only one to have such friendships. I say the only one because she did also have some friends. We even had mutual friends. But in her mind, she expected that the eyes with which she saw me had to be the same that my friends were supposed to see me. And when they did not, she wasn't happy. So she would actively speak ill of me in my absence and sadly, even in my presence. Suffice to say, the relationship went sour. Typical of me, I kept to myself. I stayed in my room and I literally kept my mouth shut. This was, of course, hugely problematic as we shared a flat, and I had to go through her room to get to mine. I guess one day she had just had enough of me. I was walking into the flat, passing to go to my room, and I can't remember what she said, to which I did not respond. Before I knew it, she was all over me, hitting me and cursing at me. I wish I could save my face and say I fought back. I didn't. Not even out of principle, but purely out of fear, out of cowardice. When I managed to free myself, I went to the police, but sadly, nothing much came from what the police called a girl's fight, and I was cool with that. I was, of course, quite hurt and distraught. When one of my friends went to speak to her about what she had done, she was apparently remorseful and apologetic. However, something that she said left me reflecting on it for years. She said that every time she saw me, something would rise up inside of her, and that is why she hated me. She kept asking herself, who beauty or Tenilo? In other words, what was so special about beauty? And that is a question I have spent the rest of my life trying to answer. I have not quite arrived at a particular answer, except that I, in taking a closer look at my life, have just found loads of evidence that I actually found favor with God. Time and space will not allow me to tell you fully about God's favor in my life. But let me just share with you a little of God's favor in my education. You see, at the writing of this book, I have now obtained two master's degrees and I didn't pay for either of them. One of the features of my educational qualifications is the fact that God's favor in directing my educational development exists to the point of even covering the fees therein. Do not get me wrong, my parents paid, my elder sister paid, I paid, but God started the journey. At some point, took over from all of us and made himself personally responsible for my educational development. I'm yet to fully discover why. To understand what I mean, let me start by drawing a brief picture of where I grew up. I was born of two uneducated parents in a rural village called Mngasha Great Place in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. Born in 1977, in a family of 8 children and 3 adults meant that I grew up in what we often refer to as apartheid South Africa. Life was not easy for Black families. Although I would later mature into and see the dawn of the Rainbow Nation, the new South Africa, I was born of people who still bear the scars of apartheid and colonialism. And sadly, those scars take time to heal. So, that little bit about where I grew up ordinarily meant that I was also poised for the common uninspiring future that most in my village would have. But God was to have it differently. In my grade 10 year, 1992, soon after the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, it seemed there was a shift in the country in, among other things, access to education. I was one of the first beneficiaries. Out of the blue, people came to our school and told us that we, my friend and I, had been selected to go and write an entrance test application to a multiracial private school called All Saints College. How we were selected, God will have to explain. To summarize the story, we went and wrote the test, and from the moment I set foot in that environment, I saw myself there. I wanted it. I wish I could say I prayed for it, but I wasn't that kind of girl at that time. Yet, God does indeed still answer those internal wishes and dreams. Long story short, I was accepted. Unfortunately, my friend, who also so wanted to get in, was not accepted. I guess All Saints College was to be the beginning of my journey alone. The celebrations of acceptance were, however, quickly dampened by the realization that the school fees at that time were 6,000 Rand per annum. This was, after all, a private school. Now we were stuck. My recently employed father was earning about 300 Rand a week with a family of 11 people to support. Although my elder sister was now working as a nurse, there was no way that my family would be able to spend 500 Rand a month on just one child's education, let alone all her other educational needs. There was, however, small print towards the end of the form, as if made for families like mine, which asked our parents to indicate how much they would actually be able to afford. So my father filled in 100 Rand and we sent it and then waited. God came through for us. I was accepted at All Saints College, paying 1,200 Rand a year in an institution that rightfully charged 6,000 Rand a year. There I was, among children who came from rich and more affording families, some of them children of ministers in government or other highly influential people in society. This poor girl from the dusty streets of Mngesha was within, wearing my hand-me-downs which my sister had collected from her friends. But the main thing, I was receiving a good quality education, which would set me on a very different trajectory to the one that I was. The rest of the All Saints story is irrelevant to the contents of this book, except to say it was at All Saints where the foundation was laid for the rest of my educational development. And that could only have happened by the grace and favor of God. So when my friend angrily asks, "What's with this beauty?" the only answer that makes sense to me is favor. I have also learned three other things about favor. First, to whom much is given, much is expected. In other words, when God gives us favor, He has also placed a high calling and a huge responsibility on our lives. He wants to use us. So before you pray for God's favor, be prepared to also take on the responsibility that comes with that favor. That is a lesson I learned only later in my adult life. Second, the grace and favor of God has appeared to all men. Titus 2 verse 11. The manner in which he manifests his favor varies from person to person. But if you were to take a closer look at your own life, you would also realize that you too have found grace and favor with God. It may not have manifested in education for you as it did with me because our assignments are different. But I promise you, you too have found favor with God. I mention this because when we talk about favor, it often tends to come across as talking about people who are more special than others. And that is not the case. What differs is the form of favor, but our God does not discriminate. In case you are one of the many people in the world who have their arms folded, waiting for someone to come and either provide for them what they need to survive or provide for them building materials, God's favor, my friend, is enough for you to get going. The rest you will unearth as you go. Remember our ancestor Adam, the very first human being placed on this earth. He left the hand of God with an instruction and favor and was placed in the Garden of Eden to figure out the rest. What God provided was the image of God, an environment, and all the raw materials he would need to accomplish the assignment, and that was enough. And if you look around you now, the world is filled with things that God never created, but He did create human beings in His own image, gave them His creative abilities, and they did the rest. So get up. Your assignment will only start as you move. Speaking of Adam, this leads me to my third point. Just like he did with our very first parents, the devil hates people who have found favor with God. So make peace with all sorts of opposition and pain and stumbling blocks and difficulties. Sadly, these tend to come in the form of other human beings whom the devil misleads into thinking that your favor makes you better than them or a threat to something in them or their lives. Please note that hatred is not personal. It is a feature of those who have found favor with God. The opposition is not meant to stop you. It is meant to fuel you. Favor in the Bible. The first time I came across the word grace or favor, it was about Noah. The Bible says Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6 verse 8. From Noah's story, I learned that when you find favor with God, know that there is a huge calling and assignment on your life. So let me say this from the get-go. There is a huge calling on your life. How do I know? Because you have found favor with God. Noah found favor. Next, he had to build a huge ark, a rather ridiculous situation where he had to build this huge ark, which ended up accommodating only 8 people and a whole lot of animals. On a deeper level, though, Noah was tasked with saving the human race from being wiped out by the flood. And we are here today because, in response to the favor of God, Noah took on that responsibility. He prevailed despite being ridiculed by those who did not understand his assignment. He pushed through despite the huge and seemingly impossible task. He pushed through despite the fear, which I'm sure was raging within him. The next I observed was the favor of God in the life of Joseph. God dispensed his grace and favor over this young man through his parents. Dare I say, through some of his brothers, through Potiphar, Pharaoh, to mention just a few. And typical of one who finds favor, look at the hectic opposition that he experienced. From the traumas he observed in his own family, the deep hatred by his brothers, being sold to slavery, rape accusation, and jail. Yet the Bible says the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor. Genesis 39, verse 21. Despite the difficulties, God's favor remains, and of course, the calling also remains. Look at the calling on Joseph's life. He had to save the nation of Israel and the nation of Egypt from the death by famine. So before you get excited about the favor of God, this is only one side of the story. And I have also observed that the bigger the favor, the bigger the calling, and of course, the bigger the opposition. I strongly believe that there's a huge calling on your life. And yes, there is big opposition, but look closely for the huge favor of God also on your life. So back to Nehemiah. Nehemiah finds favor with God, which manifested through King Artaxerxes. I love how he puts it. He says, and the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Then there are all the requests that he made to the king pertaining to his trip and the project of rebuilding the walls. Then it happened. As soon as Nehemiah started on the journey towards rebuilding, the Bible records these words. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite officially heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. He had not even begun the work, and they were already disturbed. Even before you begin to build or rebuild your life, even before you get going, just the announcement that you are going to disturbs the devil. Stay alert. And so it is not surprising to read that when they said, let us rise up and build, and then set their hands to do this good work in Nehemiah 2 verse 18, the next thing that follows is the dirty tricks of the devil using Sanballat, Tobiah, and company.